Okay, welcome to the 8th of our 12-session run on occupational health and well-being topics. Really pleased to have Dr. Mark McCaldin on, as always. Hello, Mark. Good to see you again. Today, the subject that we're discussing over the next 30 minutes or 45 minutes is on vaccinations and testing around COVID-19, a really topical subject that's on the news daily, and the situation seems to be changing almost by the hour as guidance around how we respond to the pandemic continues to change with the scientific body of evidence emerging all the time. So we thought it was useful to pull together some key questions and just help answer some of the questions that our clients have been fielding to us to help them understand the sort of steps they can take to get their employees back into the workplace safely, to help get the businesses and the economy up and running again as quickly as possible. But of course, in line with all the advice that's coming out from the government. So, Alison, if you have any feedback at the end of this session, please feel free to let us know. Very happy to take any questions throughout as well. So I'll keep an eye on the group chat if something comes up. Thanks for the thumbs up, that's fantastic. And hopefully you find it valuable. If you need to cut away, do just let me know. We'll carry on the questions anyway, just to help others get some information from this after the session. So, Mark, we've done something similar to this subject before, talking about testing and vaccinations, and the landscape, as I said, has changed quite a bit in the last couple of weeks, and we're always keeping up to date with what that is and what it means for our clients and for the individuals that use us. Probably a good place to start with this is we now know from what the government said in the guidance not so long ago, just a few days ago, that people can start coming back to work. But there's been all sorts of interpretation around what does that mean for people. And I think it's fair to say that it has caused a little bit of confusion as to what people can and can't do. And what we've extrapolated from our experience of working with people and with our own staff for that matter, is that so much of the uncertainty actually seems to be embedded in anxieties amongst people who have perhaps been on furlough for quite some time, and they don't necessarily fully understand what their workplace is doing to gear up to allow them to come back safely into the workplace. So, one of the things I think is useful to hear, especially from a qualified doctor such as yourself, is, is there anything that people should fear around coming back into the workplace when we're looking at putting in place safe measures and safe steps as we start to come out of lockdown? Or is it really just about some of the misunderstanding of the advice and guidance that's causing that unnatural anxiety amongst people?
Mark, I think this is a really exceptional time, and I would hope that nobody has any fear about returning to the workplace, because that's going to be a hurdle, a barrier to them providing regular and productive attendance at work in whatever capacity they do work for their employer. I think the key point is that, as recommended by the government, the risk assessment is the thing that's the key to giving individual employees or groups of employees reassurance and confidence that the workplace is safe for them. Now, I'm interested that you asked the question about anxiety, because it is something we've been having to discuss with employees and employers quite a bit. And what the government guidance has actually said is that if you can work from home, then you should continue to do so at the moment. Yes, they've relaxed some of the recommendations. Now, there are many sectors of the working community and business for whom working from home has not been their usual activity and is not what they would consider business as usual, but it is feasible. And the guidance still says that if you're able to work from home, particularly if you've got other reasons why you might be at risk of getting either COVID itself or serious illness as a consequence of COVID, then you certainly should continue to work from home. Of course, there are many people who can't work from home just because of the nature of what they do. And for those, it is safe for them to start returning to the workplace, assuming that safe social distancing can be maintained. Now that's a big if, isn't it? And that if has to be supported by a risk assessment that helps an employer and the employee understand whether what they do in the workplace and the people that they're around in the workplace and the processes through which they are taken through in a normal working day remain safe under the social distancing guidelines. And that's the key, really. So I think it's not so much a question of fear as one of reassurance that the appropriate assessments have been done and that people are then able to feel confident about returning to work safely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, you know, one of the steps we've been taking is in listening to clients and trying to understand what is really behind the decisions that people are making about how to get people back to work is exactly that. It's the measures that people can put in place, the risk assessments that they can do, and the guidance they can follow. And there's some good information that's being put out there by the government to help guide businesses around what they should do. And we're certainly starting to look at that and understand how to put that guidance into place. Some of the work that we've been doing then, Mark, has been around developing various steps and measures that will allow businesses to put in place safeguards to allow those people who can come back to work and who don't need to work at home to get back into the workplace safely. There's lots of ways of doing it, as we've appreciated, from self-reported screening around their personal health status and their prior risk of exposure to the disease, as well as actually taking steps to screen people as they enter the workplace, whether it's taking their temperature and clarifying any particular questions that may have come up from a self-screening process. And of course, the other area, which is really the subject of conversation today, is around making sure that there's some way in which you can, whether it's through self-screening and checks in the workplace, add on to that a mechanism for testing people and checking to see whether or not they've had any prior exposure and or any level of immunity. Quite a few little things in there that we can talk about, but I think it's probably a good place to start, given the subject today, which is all about vaccinations and testing, just to help people understand what is currently happening now as of almost today in relation to what's available in the UK, what's available to businesses around the testing part of the screening processes we put in place, and just explore that a little bit. So what does the testing look like at the moment, Mark?
Well, there are two sides to that. The first side of it is diagnostic testing, and clearly that's very important from the healthcare perspective to be able to identify individuals who have actively got the illness at the moment, who've got COVID-19 and who are at risk of getting serious disease and ending up in hospital and needing ventilation. So one arm of the testing capability that we've got is the symptomatic testing, where anybody over 5 who feels that they've got symptoms can contact the NHS and go and have a test. And that's the antigen test, the PCR swab test, which is a throat swab or a nasal swab. That's sent off to the laboratory, and that will identify whether pretty much you have the virus in your system and whether you're currently suffering the infection. Further on from that, after people have recovered, we know that with all infections, and coronavirus is no different, that our bodies mount an immune response, and we can detect immunity in the form of antibodies in the bloodstream. That testing has taken a little bit of time to come further on stream because the initial tests which were available and were developed exceedingly quickly regrettably turned out to be not sufficiently accurate to be reliable. And the problem with any test is it's got to be sufficiently sensitive and specific to pick up the thing that you're looking for and exclude the things that you're not looking for, and make sure that you don't miss any, to be able to confidently rely on it as a test of the problem. So with time, in recent weeks, the big biopharma and biotech companies have got behind this, and they have now recently developed a blood sample test which is exceedingly sensitive and exceedingly specific, meaning it correctly identifies positive cases, and there's very few false positives or false negatives, and it's useful then as a way of identifying whether anybody, an individual employee, patient, whoever, has been exposed to coronavirus and has generated antibodies. Now, one of the caveats about that is that at this point in time, we're not entirely sure whether those antibodies give long-lasting immunity or not. Hot off the press from yesterday is research from America, which suggests that actually, yes, it possibly does. They've looked at rhesus monkeys, and they found that in rhesus monkeys, it protects against reinfection with coronavirus. What we're not sure about is how long that will last. But certainly in the first instance, if you're infected once, you do develop immunity in the form of antibodies, and that seems to protect you from reinfection. So we're making progress, and we now have commercially available a highly sensitive and specific test in the UK, which is available to identify whether somebody's previously been infected, has made a good recovery, and now has antibodies against the infection, which are likely, although we're not entirely sure yet how long for, are likely to confer immunity against further infection.
Yeah, great, really helpful. And I hope that helps everybody to understand that the difference between the two types of tests and the risks around them to a degree. I think one of the areas that we've had to consider very carefully is which test to get behind, because it's been well known that these antibody tests, the finger prick tests, have been available on the market for some weeks now, many being imported from other European countries, and we actually looked at using a particular supply chain ourselves to help our clients, but have decided actually to pull back from using the finger prick test because of the problems with the validity effectively of these tests. And I think it's fair to say that there is a risk that appears to be at the centre of Public Health England's considerations with this, which is that if you're using testing in the marketplace where there is a risk of false positives, then actually we could be muddying the water. Do you want to explain a little bit about why that is likely to be the case, and therefore why we should get behind the research of the serology test that you've talked about? I think it's useful for people to understand that.
Yeah, I think it's very simple. What you need with any test is a really good discriminator. So you need to be able to be confident that what you're looking at is telling you the information you're after. And in this instance, what we're after is, does this person have lower risk of picking up COVID in the future, or risk of getting ill, because they've got antibodies against it in their bloodstream? Now, if you use a test, as some of these finger prick tests that were available 5-6 weeks ago where the accuracy of the test was in the region of 40 to 50%. That means that around half of the tests you're doing, you're getting a wrong answer. You're either getting an answer that says, yes, this person has got immunity, when they actually haven't, and clearly there's a risk of bringing them back into a social interaction if there is coronavirus around, because they could pick up the infection, or there's a risk of excluding somebody who actually has had the infection, has got immunity. If the test doesn't pick up their immunity, then you'll say, no, you're at high risk, you've got to stay at home, we can't have you coming back to the workplace, when in fact they could. And so it could generate problems either way if you are using a test which is inaccurate, but you're relying on it as if it's accurate, as if it's 100%, and you're making your decisions based upon that. So now we have a better test, which is much more accurate. That's really reassuring, because the risk stratification that you can do based upon your test, you can be much more confident of. And that's the key point when considering which groups of individuals, employees will come back into which area of activity and work, who needs to be segregated, who can work with whom. These are all considerations that human resources departments and employers are needing to think about now that the prospect of bringing employees back into the workplace is there, as long as we can have some reassurance that it's safe for them to do so.
Great, excellent. So Alison's just asked me a question, which is that a lot of her clients are asking, well, how do we get hold of these tests? Because they're asking them for them, and it has been difficult for people because of the issues we've just been discussing. And there are people who are commercially selling the finger prick tests, out on the open market into businesses. And there is, for the reasons you've just outlined, some big questions to ask around whether that is a sensible, ethical, and perhaps the right thing to do. So what we've decided to do as a business is to get behind where the evidence sits, which is a test based on taking a blood sample, these serology tests, which give us a 100% assurance around around the outcomes of the test. And the way we're managing this is we're able to offer this type of test to our clients and to really anybody that needs them in the UK through our lab. We're just poised right now to start being able to mobilize that and offer that out. And what I would say to you, Alison, is that if you would like to talk about that in more detail in relation to your particular clients, please do reach out to me after this Zoom call, and we'll gladly follow up the conversation with you and help you understand how you can access these tests. So taking that theme forward though, where we see the place of the testing, both the PCR testing, the swab tests, which you outlined at the beginning, and the antibody tests, is very much as part of a pathway, a screening pathway that businesses can choose to adopt components of. And what we found is some businesses might just want to have a robust self-screening process in place with some backup from doctors and nurses who know how to advise on some of the other medical related issues, whether it's to do with self-isolation or comorbidities or drugs that they might be taking. So there's a combination of self-screening, which is a simple approach to just looking at whether that individual is at risk, and backing that up with a professional consultation over the telephone, over Zoom, through our video clinical system, if that's what's required, to give employers and employees the reassurances they need about whether to return someone to work. The other aspect then is around, as I said before, whether businesses choose to have some form of on-site screening, where they can have the temperature check measures and some further questioning, and of course there's a backup that we can offer to people who might be sent home if they are identified as having a problem. We have a hotline effectively into our services that will allow businesses to access advice and guidance, and essentially provide people with a fit note on whether or not they are fit to go to work or not. So that's something that people can look at if they want to. Looking at the longer term picture though then, so let's assume that people have put in place some of these measures, they understand the testing that's available to them, they understand how to access it, and they understand that, you know, there is a need to look long term around how you continue to manage the workforce over the next 6 to 12 months. What's our view, Mark, on the kind of the longer term? We've touched on it a bit, but what's our view on the longer term immunity and the types of measures that businesses might want to start thinking about to manage risk and keep the employment of their employees going? Because, you know, the reality is people are going to continue to get sick in some capacity, although we hope the infection rate will drop off a lot. But I think businesses are going to want to make sure that they risk assess the long term, not just the short term return to work. Have you got any tips or advice or insights as to how we're advising businesses to look at the longer term picture as well as the short term?
I think, again, this is a really interesting question because realistically at the moment, we just don't know enough about this particular virus and about how it behaves in our systems and what it does to our immune system to generate a response, and what that means in terms of our future resilience against reinfection. If this virus is like many of the other coronaviruses, which are much less lethal and cause essentially symptoms of the common cold, then the likelihood is that we won't get lifelong immunity from it. So even if we've had the infection and recovered, the likelihood is that infection will dwindle with time. And if we see coronavirus persisting around the globe and continuing to cause the level of illness and the level of fatality that we're currently seeing, then it raises the possibility that we may need to continue to monitor people for their individual immunity to be reassured that they remain fit to work in a social setting where they're having interaction with other people. Now you can anticipate that may not be the case, and actually things may settle down. We may get to the situation where coronavirus actually burns itself out, and that's been a future picture that has been proposed by some epidemiologists, some specialists in infection, who said, no, we think that there's potentially this coronavirus pandemic will burn out, and then there won't be very much of it around in future, and it's not going to become a problem in the long term. Alternatively, some people think, well, actually, no, the worst case is true, which is that coronavirus is with us for good. None of us are going to get particularly immune to it for very long. We're all going to be continually susceptible to it throughout our lives. And what we need to do then is to think about how we protect ourselves, whether it's through intermittent social isolation and lockdown, whether it's through a vaccination program, whether it's through immunity testing to prove that people can have social contact between each other. There are a whole range of possible interventions, but it just depends how we find this virus behaves over the next 6 to 12 months, not forgetting that we're only still in the first 6 months of its existence, really, in human infection terms, in a global way. So it's still very new, and we still don't really know a great deal. From the perspective of a business, I guess it then is a question of thinking, well, worst case scenario, who are the critical individuals that we might need to have regular, frequent reassurance about? And how do we identify those individuals and make sure that we've picked up on their health and have them screened regularly enough to be reassured that they're not going to become unwell? Some businesses may say that's pointless to do that. We don't need to do that. What we do need to do is wait and see what happens. And that's absolutely fine. But again, it's about risk stratification. And the hardest thing I think for us at the moment as occupational health advisors is there just is insufficient information to be able to give a clear answer. And to an extent, we're all hedging our bets a little bit and saying, well, we hope that things are going to settle down significantly and most people will be able to get back to work safely relatively soon.
Yeah, great. And that brings us nicely to the other kind of key half of this whole conversation today, which is around that longer term position on the vaccinations themselves. Lots of debate about whether or not there will be a vaccine, how long is it going to take to roll out. Lots of biotech firms around the world and various universities, Oxford leading a group at the moment, trying to come up with a vaccine. And there are lots of different stories about what that looks like right now. I think it would be helpful for people to understand at its basic level, perhaps to start with, what are we trying to achieve with a vaccine in outline, and then maybe swing into where do we think we are at the moment in relation to the use of a vaccine, if indeed we actually ever get one that is going to provide a long-term solution. So could we just start with what are we trying to achieve with the vaccination program for businesses, and where's its place, and then maybe talk about the latter?
I'm slightly smiling because I'm wondering how long you've got.
Well,
there are some enormous questions for science in that brief set of questions you've asked, and I think the answer is that what are we looking for? We're looking for a safe vaccine that doesn't harm people. It mustn't cause any problems, long-term significant problems for their health. Nearly every vaccine has got some very short-term side effects: a slightly sore arm, a bruise, perhaps, maybe a slight raise in your body temperature as your immune system reacts to the vaccine. But the golden prize, if you like, from a vaccination point of view, is identifying a part of this virus which is enough to show our immune system that it's there and create antibodies which will neutralize the virus if we ever come across it again, without making us sick and without causing unpleasant side effects that are unacceptable for something which is a preventive measure. Now, if we can get that, and notwithstanding, we've got that for many infectious diseases in the world at the moment. The development of vaccines, the vaccination programs internationally have been an overwhelming and resounding success in terms of improving public health and preventing disease globally. So we've been able to do it for a large range of infections. We've never yet been able to do it for the common cold. And that's for a whole host of reasons to do with the specific problems with those viruses, of which there are many, and none of them have any sufficiently common features for us to be able to find one that will allow us to prevent illness caused by all of them. But so the point is we need a safe test. We need a test which is acceptable. It needs to be relatively cheap because it costs thousands of pounds a dose. Again, that's not going to be acceptable on an economic basis. And we need it to be able to confer sufficiently lasting immunity that it's worthwhile. So giving somebody a vaccine that only lasts for a month, it's not worthwhile. You'd have to vaccinate somebody 12 times a year. That's not sensible. What we're hoping to find is a vaccine that will give people lasting immunity, preferably longer than a year, maybe 3 or 5, but who knows? You know, I think at the moment the international community is open to all offers, and we'll see what we get. And because there are so many researchers and developers in biotech working on this, the likelihood is that we will get something somewhat equivalent to existing vaccines in the relatively near future. The time that it will then take to roll that out across a nation and to produce enough doses to be able to undertake a mass vaccination campaign is a completely different matter. And that depends upon infrastructure, manufacturing infrastructure, and then healthcare infrastructure to be able to deliver the product. But I think we're getting significantly closer. And again, on the back of the research from America yesterday about immunity in monkeys, they have also tested the same cohort of primates with a potential vaccine candidate, and they've had encouraging results. So, you know, we're not there yet, but it looks like we're making progress.
Okay, and I guess because of the novel nature of this virus, you know, there's so many uncertainties about, you know, the longer term sort of lasting effects of any kind of immunity. And I guess until we've actually kind of developed that track record, we're just not going to know. So when we sit back and look at the implications of all of that then for businesses, I guess what businesses are going to have to do is to get their head around the idea that, you know, we don't have a vaccine yet. We may not have one for some time, however cautiously the government is approaching that conversation with people. But at the same time, the government wants to get businesses back up and running and get the economy going again. So it seems to us that there's going to be a transition around how you take on board risk-assessed measures to screen and monitor your employee workforce and to put in place the safeguards to allow your businesses to open up and get going again, whilst at the same time waiting for the development of some kind of vaccination, however, you know, effective that might be or not. And even if we do get a vaccination, there's no guarantee at this stage that it will last a long time. So having that thought process around, you know, putting in place a regular, you know, immunity checking type program, where you can continue to monitor the risk of exposure of your employees so that you can continue to manage the social distancing in the workplace, is important, isn't it? I think we've got to look at both sides of this rather than wait for one, you know, sort of silver bullet in terms of a vaccination that's going to be the sort of the panacea of all ills, because I think what we're saying to clients is it probably isn't going to be.
Yes, and I think we can anticipate, rather like the testing scenario, particularly the PCR swabbing scenario, where the swabs are being offered for people who are symptomatic as a healthcare measure. When vaccination becomes available, and I'm saying when, not if, because I'm really quite confident that a vaccine of one kind or another will become available, I think we can be guaranteed that the national health system will prioritize that vaccination for the vulnerable groups. So the people for whom that vaccine will be made available initially is going to be the people at the highest risk of serious illness and death from COVID. Now, that's not necessarily the employee base who are going to work for business and trying to get the economy back on its feet. And so, rather like so many other things in life, it will fall back to the responsibility of the individual employer to decide whether they want to invest in a vaccination program for certain members of their staff who perhaps wouldn't be entitled through the health system, to be able to give them confidence that their immunity is sufficient to come into the workplace if COVID is back up, you know, if there's another resurgence of COVID in the community. And that's a fairly big if. And again, that depends upon the availability of vaccine, but it also depends upon the cost and the acceptability of the vaccination. So it may be that a once a yearly vaccine is required, a little bit like the influenza vaccine. And I can imagine that in future years, we might be rolling COVID-19 vaccine in with influenza and making it a kind of, you know, a multiple jab in one needle. Alternatively, it may be that the COVID vaccine lasts a little bit longer, like typhoid, it maybe lasts 3 years, or some other infections, it lasts 5 years, 10 years, or even longer. We don't know at this stage, but I think we can confidently predict that the vaccine will become available, but will be prioritized through our health service to those of the greatest need, and therefore business may be called upon, if you like, you know, just by default, to consider whether it wants to provide that service independently for its employees as a safety measure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've just had a question come in saying, is there a vaccine actually being, produced in the UK at the moment? As we kind of alluded to before, we kind of know that there are multiple organisations around the world now, all it's a bit like a sort of a mini arms race to try and come up with a vaccination that's going to be the solution for the global population. Unprecedented, really, given where we are. Never happened in history, as far as I know, on this sort of scale. With the modern tech that's now at biotech firms' disposal. So it's a fascinating exercise. But yes, we do have organisations. I think that the forerunner at the moment is at Oxford University, where they have a dedicated team trying to pull a vaccination together. And I think from what I've heard in the press and the scientific news that there are some promising signs that it could be a vaccination that has legs, but we don't know yet. And I think this is the point. We can't put all of our eggs in any one basket, and businesses still have to get up and running and put in place measures to safeguard their staff so they can get their businesses operating. And waiting for a vaccine at this stage probably isn't the answer to their risk assessments. Is that fair to say?
We're in research and development at the moment. I think from the vaccine point of view, we can expect a minimum of 6 to 9 months before a vaccine's commercially available. And even then, it will take time for that to be able to be scaled up for major use and widespread distribution. So the prospect of a vaccine within the turn of this year is highly unlikely, but within the turn of 2021 to 22 is a bit more likely.
Yeah, and of course, quite a lot of uncertainty around that. I did pick up that the government's investing heavily in effectively manufacturing plants for a vaccination should a vaccine become available, so it can be ramped up to scale. But as you say, even with a fair wind behind that, it's going to take a bit of time for that to come off. Great, that's fantastic. Well, I hope that that's covered off most of the issues that we've certainly been tackling and helping businesses to address, up till now. And of course, we'll keep these sessions going over the next few weeks. We'll adapt and change them as more information becomes available. So unless there's any other questions coming in, Alison, I hope that's been helpful for you. We normally try and round things off at about the 30 to 45 minute mark. We've done quite well today. We're on 35 minutes. So one last opportunity for you, Alison. If you'd like to ask any more questions, we can pick them up, or we can pause it there, and we will be doing the same sort of thing, same place, same time next week from 3 till 4. So thank you from everybody at Newcastle Premier Health. Wish you well and good health, and have a good evening. Thank you.